The coffee shop buzzed with morning energy as Sarah Martinez clutched her phone, reading the text message for the 10th time. Her husband David had sent it at 6 in the morning, meeting with Johnson today. Finally, going to tell him what I think about the promotion situation. Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what David meant. For 3 months, he had been watching his colleague Marcus get credit for projects David had designed. Marcus had a way of presenting David's ideas as collaborative efforts, then, somehow becoming the face of every success. Yesterday, David discovered that Marcus had been promoted to senior architect while David remained stuck in his current position. "Don't do this," Sarah whispered to herself, quickly typing a response. "Remember what we talked about. This fight isn't worth your career." Her phone rang immediately. David's voice was tight with frustration. "Sarah, I can't keep letting this happen. Johnson needs to know the truth about who really designed the Riverside project and the Morrison building renovation. I have all the emails, all the original sketches with my timestamps." Sarah looked around the coffee shop, lowering her voice. "David, listen to me. I know you're angry. I know this feels unfair. But, confronting Johnson like this, when you're emotional, it's going to backfire. Marcus has been playing politics for years. You're walking into his game. So I should just stay quiet? Let him steal my work forever? No, but there's a right way to handle this. Document everything properly. Talk to HR first. Build a case instead of having an emotional outburst." Sarah could hear David's breathing getting heavier. "Please, honey. Avoid this fight today. At least until we can plan this properly." David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer but determined. "Sarah, I appreciate what you're trying to do. But I've been quiet for too long. Johnson respects directness. If I go to him like a man and lay out the facts, he'll see the truth." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen David like this before, convinced that his honesty and straightforward approach would win the day. It was one of the things she loved about him, but also what worried her most. David saw the world as a place where truth and hard work naturally triumphed. He had never learned to navigate the darker currents of office politics. "David, you're not hearing me. This isn't about facts or truth. This is about perception and power. Marcus has been building relationships and managing his image. You've been building buildings. Those are different games. I'm not playing games, Sarah. I'm doing my job. And that's exactly the problem." Sarah realized her voice was getting too loud and looked around apologetically. "Marcus isn't just doing his job. He's positioning himself, creating narratives, making sure the right people see him in the right light. When you march into Johnson's office with your evidence, you're going to look like someone who can't handle workplace dynamics." David sighed heavily. "So what, I should become like Marcus? Schmooze and manipulate and take credit for other people's work?" "No, but you need to be smarter about how you approach this. Johnson already sees Marcus as the rising star. If you go in there looking desperate or accusatory, you'll just confirm Marcus's narrative that you're not leadership material." Sarah could hear David moving around, probably pacing in his car before work. This was his tell when he was getting more agitated, not less. "Sarah, I love you for caring about me, but you don't understand what it's like. Every day I watch Marcus in meetings, nodding along while I present ideas, then, somehow by the end of the week, those ideas are being called Marcus's innovative approach. I can't keep living like this. I do understand, more than you know." Sarah's voice grew softer. "I've watched you come home frustrated for months. I've seen how this is eating at you. But, David, I'm begging you. This confrontation you're planning, it feels like justice to you, but it's going to look like sour grapes to everyone else." There was a long pause. Sarah could hear office sounds in the background now. David had arrived at work. "Sarah, you've never steered me wrong before, but this time, I think you're being too cautious. Sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even if it's uncomfortable." Sarah felt tears starting to form. David, I'm not being cautious. I'm being realistic. I've worked in corporate environments longer than you have. I've seen good people destroy their careers by picking fights they thought were righteous. Please, just wait. Give me a week to help you put together a strategy that actually works. A week? Sarah, the quarterly reviews are next Friday. If I don't speak up now, Marcus is going to get credit for the Henderson project too. That's the biggest commission our firm has landed in 5 years. I led that design team. I can't let him steal that too. Sarah understood now why David felt so urgent, but it made her even more worried. The Henderson project is exactly why you need to be careful. If that's really as big as you say, then Johnson is going to be very protective of anything that might threaten its success. Rocking the boat right now could backfire in ways you haven't considered. Or it could finally get me the recognition I deserve. David's voice had that stubborn edge that Sarah knew well. Sarah, I know you mean well, but you're asking me to compromise my integrity. I can't look at myself in the mirror if I let Marcus take credit for Henderson. Sarah felt a desperate frustration building. David was such a good man, but he had blind spots about how the world actually worked. It's not about compromising your integrity. It's about being strategic. David, please, I'm literally begging you. Don't have this conversation with Johnson today. Sleep on it. Talk to me tonight. Let's figure out a better approach. Sarah. David's voice was gentler now. I hear you. I really do. But I've made up my mind. I'm going to present the facts clearly and professionally. I'm not going to attack Marcus personally. I'm just going to show Johnson the timeline of the projects and let the evidence speak for itself. Sarah realized she was losing this argument, and it terrified her. David, the evidence won't speak for itself. Evidence needs interpretation, and Marcus has been shaping how people interpret things for months. You're walking into a trap. Maybe you're right about the politics, but I have to believe that good work eventually gets recognized. If Johnson is the leader I think he is, he'll see what's really happening. Sarah felt like screaming. David's faith in fairness and meritocracy was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. What if he's not the leader you think he is? What if he already knows what Marcus is doing and doesn't care because Marcus makes his life easier? What if Johnson sees you as the problem for bringing him complications he doesn't want to deal with? Then, at least I'll know where I stand. David's voice was resolute now. Sarah, I love you for trying to protect me, but I can't live my life afraid of what might happen if I stand up for myself. I have to try. Sarah felt defeated. She had used every argument she could think of, but David was determined to see this as a matter of principle rather than strategy. David, if you're really going to do this, at least promise me you'll be careful about how you phrase things. Don't make it sound like you're accusing Johnson of being blind or stupid. Don't make Marcus the villain of the story. Just present your work and ask for appropriate recognition. That's exactly what I plan to do. And promise me you'll stay calm. If Johnson pushes back or seems skeptical, don't get defensive. Just present your facts and leave it at that. I promise. Sarah didn't believe him. She knew David too well. When he felt wronged, his emotions took over, and his careful plans went out the window. David, I love you. You know that, right? I'm not trying to hold you back or make you weak. I'm trying to protect your future. I know, and I love you too. But, Sarah, sometimes protecting the future means fighting for what's right today. After they hung up, Sarah sat in the coffee shop for another 20 minutes, staring at her phone. She thought about calling David's office, thought about finding a way to delay his meeting with Johnson. But she knew that would only make things worse. David would feel betrayed, and it would damage their marriage without actually solving the problem. Instead, she found herself thinking about her own career. She had always been the more cautious one, the one who played by the rules and advanced slowly but steadily. She had never had David's talent for design or his passionate commitment to his work, but she had developed a keen understanding of how organizations really functioned. She knew that justice and fairness were luxuries that most workplaces couldn't afford, especially when business was involved. David saw his upcoming confrontation with Johnson as a moment of truth. Sarah saw it as the beginning of the end of his career at Morrison & Associates. She hoped desperately that she was wrong, but experience had taught her to trust her instincts about these situations. As she walked to her own office, Sarah found herself thinking about all the times she had given David advice about workplace politics. He listened politely, but he never really internalized what she was trying to tell him. He believed too strongly in the power of truth and hard work. He couldn't see that those virtues, while admirable, weren't enough to navigate complex human dynamics. Sarah spent the morning trying to focus on her own work, but she kept checking her phone, waiting for David to text her about how the meeting went. She imagined different scenarios, most of them ending badly. She pictured David getting emotional, Johnson getting defensive, Marcus somehow turning the whole situation to his advantage. By lunchtime, she still hadn't heard anything. That worried her even more than an angry phone call would have. She knew David well enough to know that if the meeting had gone well, he would have texted her immediately to share his victory. The silence meant either that things had gone very badly, or that David was still in meetings trying to manage the fallout. Sarah realized that regardless of how today's conversation went, this was just the beginning. David had chosen to fight, and now they would all have to live with the consequences. She just hoped that when the dust settled, their marriage and David's integrity would survive intact. But, as she sat in her office that afternoon, watching the clock and waiting for news, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to watch the man she loved learn some very hard lessons about how the world really worked. And she wasn't sure either of them was ready for what that education was going to cost. David Martinez walked into the Morrison & Associates building that Tuesday morning with a briefcase full of evidence and a heart full of righteous determination. Despite Sarah's warnings echoing in his mind, he felt more confident than he had in months. Today, he would finally set the record straight about his contributions to the firm's most successful projects. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual. David reviewed his strategy one more time. He would present the facts chronologically, starting with the Riverside project from 6 months ago. He had the original email chain where he had proposed the innovative water management system that had won them the contract. He had his initial sketches, timestamped and saved in the company system. He had witness statements from junior architects who had worked directly with him on the design. When the elevator doors opened, David noticed that the office seemed unusually quiet. His assistant, Jennifer, looked up nervously as he passed her desk. "Mr. Martinez, Mr. Johnson wants to see you in his office right away." David felt a small surge of satisfaction. Johnson must have heard about his request for a meeting and was eager to discuss the situation. This was exactly the kind of direct, immediate response that David appreciated in a leader. "Perfect," David replied, adjusting his tie. "I've been looking forward to this conversation." Jennifer's expression remained troubled. "He asked me to tell you to bring all your current project files." This struck David as odd, but he assumed Johnson wanted to review his work as part of their discussion about recognition and promotion. David gathered his materials and headed toward the corner office, past Marcus's desk. Marcus looked up and gave him a strange smile, almost sympathetic. "Good luck in there, David," Marcus said quietly. "I hope everything works out." David nodded curtly. He wasn't sure what game Marcus was playing now, but it didn't matter. In a few minutes, Johnson would know the truth about who deserved credit for the firm's recent successes. Richard Johnson's office was a shrine to architectural achievement. Model buildings lined the shelves, awards covered the walls, and large windows overlooked the city skyline. Johnson himself was standing behind his desk, studying a document. He looked up as David entered, his expression unreadable. "David, come in. Please, have a seat." David sat down and placed his briefcase on the floor beside him. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for making time to meet with me. I know you're busy, but I think this conversation is long overdue." Johnson returned to his chair, folding his hands on the desk. Yes, I think you're right about that. David, I'm going to be direct with you because I respect you and your work. We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to my attention. David felt a flicker of confusion. This wasn't how he had expected the conversation to begin. Concerns? About my work quality? Not about your technical abilities, no. Those have never been in question. You're a talented architect, David. But there are other aspects of professional performance that we need to address. David's confidence began to waver slightly. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Johnson picked up the document he had been reading. Yesterday, I received a report from Marcus Chin about some troubling behavior he's observed over the past few months. He's concerned about your ability to work collaboratively and your reaction to feedback and guidance. David's blood pressure spiked. This was exactly what Sarah had warned him about, but hearing it actually happen felt surreal. Mr. Johnson, I think there may be some misunderstanding here. I actually came to discuss the opposite situation. Oh? What situation is that? David opened his briefcase, pulling out his carefully organized folders. I have documentation here that shows I've been the primary designer on several major projects that Marcus has been taking credit for. I have emails, timestamps, witness statements. I think once you see this evidence, you'll understand why I might seem frustrated with our collaboration. Johnson's expression grew more serious. David, I need to stop you right there. What you're describing sounds exactly like what Marcus warned me about. He said you've been questioning the collaborative nature of your recent projects and might make accusations about credit and recognition. David felt the ground shifting beneath him. He warned you? When did this conversation take place? Marcus came to me 3 weeks ago. He was very concerned about your attitude and wanted to discuss how to help you adjust your perspective about teamwork and shared leadership in our project structure. David stared at Johnson, trying to process this information. 3 weeks ago was right after the Henderson project had been announced as a major success. Marcus had somehow anticipated this exact conversation and had preemptively shaped Johnson's understanding of the situation. Mr. Johnson, I think Marcus may have misrepresented things. Can I show you these documents? Johnson held up a hand. David, before we go down that path, I want you to understand something. Marcus has been with this firm for 8 years. He's been consistently promoted because he understands how to lead teams and manage complex projects. His approach to collaboration has been extremely effective for our bottom line. But the specific innovations that made these projects successful, the design elements that won us the contracts, those came from my work. I can prove that. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that Marcus was worried about. Johnson's voice grew firmer. David, successful architecture firms don't succeed because of individual genius. They succeed because talented people work together, build on each other's ideas, and create something better than any one person could achieve alone. David felt his carefully planned presentation crumbling. I understand that, Mr. Johnson. I'm not trying to diminish anyone else's contributions. But I think there's a difference between collaboration and one person taking credit for another person's core innovations. Is that what you think is happening here? Yes, sir. That's exactly what I think is happening. Johnson leaned back in his chair, studying David carefully. David, I'm going to ask you a difficult question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you think it's possible that your perception of these situations might be colored by frustration about your career progression? David felt heat rising in his face. Are you suggesting that I'm making this up because I'm disappointed about not getting promoted? I'm suggesting that sometimes when we're feeling overlooked or undervalued, we start to see collaboration as competition, and we start to see shared credit as theft. David pulled out his first folder. Mr. Johnson, with respect, I think if you look at these documents, you'll see that this isn't about perception or frustration. This is about factual timelines and documented contributions. Johnson accepted the folder but didn't open it. Before I look at this, David, I want to ask you something else.
how do you think this conversation is going to end? What outcome are you hoping for?
David hadn't expected this question. I'm hoping you'll recognize my contributions and make sure I get appropriate credit and consideration for future opportunities.
And what about Marcus? What happens to him in your ideal scenario?
David hesitated. He hadn't really thought about the implications for Marcus beyond wanting him to stop taking undeserved credit. I suppose Marcus would need to be more accurate about crediting his team members' specific contributions.
Johnson nodded slowly. David, let me paint a picture for you. Marcus generates more billable hours than any other architect in this firm. His projects come in on time and under budget. His clients specifically request to work with him again. His teams report high satisfaction levels. From a business perspective, Marcus is exactly the kind of employee we want to promote and reward. But what if his success is built on appropriating other people's work? That's a very serious accusation. Are you prepared to prove that Marcus has intentionally and systematically stolen your ideas? David opened his mouth to respond, then realized the trap he was walking into. Proving intentional theft would require demonstrating malicious intent, not just showing that his ideas had been incorporated into collaborative projects. Johnson continued, because if you can't prove intentional theft, then what you're really complaining about is that your ideas became part of successful team efforts led by Marcus. And that, David, is exactly how collaborative architecture is supposed to work. David felt his arguments slipping away. But my name should be associated with my innovations. Your name is associated with the projects. You're listed as a key team member on every project we've discussed. Your work is documented in our internal systems. What you seem to want is for your name to be elevated above other team members, including the project leader. That's not what I want. Then, what exactly do you want? David realized he was losing control of the conversation. Everything he said was being reframed by Johnson in ways that made him sound petty or self-aggrandizing. I want recognition for my specific contributions to these projects' success. And, you feel that working under Marcus's leadership doesn't provide that recognition? No, it doesn't. Johnson finally opened the folder David had given him, glancing quickly through the documents. David, I see emails here where you're proposing ideas and Marcus is responding with feedback and development suggestions. I see collaborative exchanges that look exactly like what I would expect from a senior architect mentoring a talented junior colleague. But, the final innovations that made the project successful, those were my ideas. Ideas that were refined and implemented under Marcus's leadership, with his guidance and project management. David felt trapped. Every piece of evidence he had gathered was being interpreted through a lens that made Marcus look like an effective leader and David look like someone who didn't understand how teams worked. Johnson closed the folder. David, I think I understand what's happening here. You're a very talented individual contributor. You have excellent technical skills and creative instincts. But, you're struggling to understand your role in a collaborative environment. I collaborate fine. I just want appropriate credit. And, that's exactly the attitude that Marcus was concerned about. Johnson's voice was getting more formal. David, let me be very clear about something. In this firm, project leaders get primary credit for project success. Team members get recognition for their contributions, but the overall success belongs to the person who managed the project from conception to completion. Even if the key innovations came from team members? Especially then. A good project leader's job is to create an environment where team members can do their best work and, then, synthesize that work into successful outcomes. That's exactly what Marcus has been doing. David sat in silence for a moment, realizing that his entire understanding of the situation had been wrong. He had thought he was fighting for justice and recognition. Johnson saw him as an employee who didn't understand professional hierarchies and collaborative work. Mr. Johnson, I think there may be a fundamental disagreement here about how credit should be assigned. Yes, I think there is. And, David, that's a problem. Because your understanding doesn't align with how successful architecture firms operate. David felt the conversation shifting into dangerous territory. Are you saying that my perspective on this is grounds for disciplinary action? Johnson paused for a long moment.
I'm saying that your perspective on this suggests you might not be a good fit for a leadership role in this organization. And, based on this conversation, I'm concerned about whether you're fully committed to our collaborative culture. David realized with growing horror that his attempt to secure recognition and advancement had instead raised questions about his future with the firm entirely. Sarah's warnings echoed in his head, but it was too late to retreat now.
Mr. Johnson, I think this conversation has gotten off track.
I'm absolutely committed to collaboration and teamwork.
I just want to make sure that individual contributions are appropriately recognized within that framework. And I'm telling you that your definition of appropriate recognition doesn't match our organizational values.
David felt everything slipping away. The conversation he had imagined as his moment of vindication had become a referendum on his professional future. And, somehow, Marcus had managed to position himself as the concerned mentor while David was cast as the difficult employee who couldn't work well with others.
Mr. Johnson, is there a way we can reset this conversation? I feel like we may have gotten started on the wrong foot.
Johnson studied him carefully. David, I think the best thing we can do right now is take some time to think about whether there's a path forward that works for everyone involved. I'm going to ask you to take the rest of the week off, paid leave, to consider your priorities and your commitment to our team approach. David felt his world collapsing. Paid leave was often the first step toward more serious disciplinary action. Sir, I don't think that's necessary. I can adjust my approach to better align with the firm's expectations.
I hope you can, David. I really do.
Because you're a talented architect, and I'd hate to lose you.
But talent alone isn't enough if it can't function within our collaborative framework.
As David walked out of Johnson's office, he realized that in trying to fight for his recognition, he had instead raised fundamental questions about his place in the organization. And, somewhere behind him, Marcus was probably already hearing about how the conversation had gone, already planning his next move in a game David was only beginning to understand he was playing. David sat in his car in the Morrison & Associates parking garage, staring at his phone. He had been there for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to call Sarah and explain what had just happened. Every time he started to dial her number, he remembered her warning from that morning, "This fight isn't worth your career." His hands were shaking slightly as he finally pressed her contact.
Sarah answered on the second ring. "David? How did it go?"
The concern in her voice nearly broke him.
"Sarah, I think I made a terrible mistake."
There was a pause.
"What happened?"
David told her everything, from Marcus's preemptive conversation with Johnson to the forced paid leave. As he spoke, he could hear Sarah's breathing getting more controlled, which meant she was trying not to say "I told you so." When he finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment.
"David, are you somewhere safe? Can you drive?"
"I'm in the parking garage."
"I'm okay to drive, just shaken up. Come home. We need to talk about this in person."
The drive home felt like a funeral procession. David kept replaying the conversation with Johnson, looking for moments where he could have said something different, where he could have salvaged the situation. But, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Marcus had orchestrated this outcome weeks in advance. Sarah was waiting for him in their kitchen, 2 cups of coffee already prepared. She hugged him tightly before they sat down, but David could feel the tension in her body. "Tell me again exactly what Johnson said about the paid leave," she said.
David repeated Johnson's words as precisely as he could remember them.
Sarah listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad. "Okay," she said when he finished. "This is serious, but it's not necessarily fatal. Paid leave can be a cooling-off period, or it can be the first step toward termination. We need to figure out which one this is and respond appropriately."
"How do we do that?"
Sarah pulled out her laptop.
"First, we're going to research Morrison & Associates Employee Handbook and Disciplinary Procedures. Then, we're going to document everything that happened today while it's still fresh in your memory.
And then, we're going to figure out what your options are." David watched Sarah work with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. She was approaching this crisis with the same systematic thinking she brought to everything, while he felt like he was drowning in the consequences of his own naive mistakes.
Sarah, I should have listened to you this morning. You tried to warn me, and I thought I knew better.
Sarah looked up from her laptop.
David, I'm not interested in being right about this. I'm interested in fixing it.
We can analyze what went wrong later, but right now we need to focus on damage control. For the next 2 hours, they worked together to understand David's situation. Sarah pulled up Morrison & Associates' public information, employee reviews on workplace websites, and news articles about the firm's recent projects. Meanwhile, David wrote detailed notes about every interaction he had had with Marcus over the past 6 months. What they discovered was not encouraging. Morrison & Associates had a pattern of quietly pushing out employees who were perceived as difficult or not team players.
The firm priced smooth operations and client satisfaction above individual recognition.
Several former employees had posted online reviews mentioning similar situations where talented architects had been marginalized for challenging the firm's collaborative hierarchy.
David, look at this, Sarah said, pointing to her screen.
3 architects have left Morrison & Associates in the past 2 years under circumstances that sound remarkably similar to yours. They all complained about credit and recognition, and they all ended up leaving after disciplinary actions related to team collaboration issues.
David felt sick. So this is Marcus's standard playbook? It looks like it might be. And if that's the case, then Johnson might be complicit, or at least willingly blind to what's happening.
Sarah continued researching while David called his friend Tony, another architect who had worked at Morrison & Associates a few years earlier.
Tony's reaction to David's story was immediate and alarmed.
David, you need to get out of there as soon as possible, Tony said.
I've heard rumors about Marcus for years.
He's very good at what he does, but what he does isn't just architecture.
He's a political operator.
The guys who try to challenge him directly don't last long.
But surely if I present enough evidence. David, listen to me.
Evidence doesn't matter if the person evaluating it is already predisposed to see you as the problem.
Johnson has probably been getting reports about your attitude for weeks. Your meeting today just confirmed everything Marcus had already told him.
After the call with Tony, David felt even worse. But Sarah had continued her research and had found something potentially helpful. David, I think there might be a way to reframe this situation, but it's going to require you to swallow your pride.
What do you mean?
Sarah turned her laptop toward him. Morrison & Associates has a mentorship program for architects who are transitioning into leadership roles. It's designed to help talented individual contributors develop collaborative leadership skills. If you approach Johnson and ask to be enrolled in this program, it accomplishes several things.
David, read the program description.
It makes it look like I've recognized my shortcomings and want to improve.
Exactly. Instead of being the problem employee who doesn't understand teamwork, you become the proactive employee who's seeking to develop professionally.
It gives Johnson a face-saving way to bring you back from paid leave, and it gives you time to figure out your next move. David hated the idea of essentially admitting that he had been wrong, but he could see the strategic value. And it buys us time to document Marcus's behavior more systematically.
Right.
If you're in a mentorship program, you have legitimate reasons to be meeting with various people in the firm, asking questions about project management and team leadership. You can gather information about how other projects have been handled, whether Marcus's approach is standard, and whether other people have had similar concerns. David considered this plan. It felt like surrender, but it was also probably his only realistic option for staying employed while he figured out his long-term strategy.
What if Johnson doesn't go for it? What if he sees through what I'm trying to do?
Sarah closed her laptop. Then, you'll be in the same position you're in now, except you'll have tried a constructive approach instead of just waiting to see what happens. David, you have to assume that Marcus is already working on the next phase of his plan. He's not going to just wait and see if you've learned your lesson.
That evening, David spent hours crafting an email to Johnson.
He wrote draft after draft, trying to strike the right tone of humility and professional growth without sounding insincere. Sarah reviewed each version, helping him remove language that sounded defensive or calculated.
The final email was brief and direct.
David acknowledged that the conversation had helped him recognize some blind spots in his understanding of collaborative leadership. He expressed interest in developing his team management skills and asked whether the firm's mentorship program might be appropriate for him. He thanked Johnson for his patience and guidance.
"It's good," Sarah said after reading the final version.
"It sounds genuine, and it gives Johnson an easy way to say yes."
David sent the email before he could second-guess himself further.
Then, he and Sarah spent the rest of the evening talking about backup plans.
What would they do if Johnson rejected the mentorship proposal? What would they do if David was ultimately forced to leave Morrison and Associates?
"The good news is that you're talented and you have a solid portfolio," Sarah said. "If worse comes to worst, other firms will want to hire you."
"But they'll ask why I left Morrison."
"And Marcus will probably give me a terrible reference."
"Maybe.
But there are ways to handle that. We can be proactive about explaining the situation, and you have other colleagues who can speak to your abilities." Despite Sarah's reassurances, David spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying the disaster of his confrontation with Johnson. He kept thinking about moments where he could have said something different, or he could have been smarter about the politics involved. But he also found himself angry about the entire situation. Why should he have to play these games?
Why couldn't good work and honest communication be enough? Why did someone like Marcus get rewarded for manipulation and political maneuvering?
"Because that's how the world works," he whispered to himself, remembering Sarah's warnings from that morning. "And you were too stubborn to listen."
At 3 a.m, David's phone buzzed with an email notification.
Johnson had responded to his mentorship program request.
David's heart pounded as he opened the message.
"David, I appreciate your message and your willingness to approach this situation constructively.
Let's discuss the mentorship program when you return to the office on Monday.
I think this could be a positive step forward for your professional development." Richard David felt a mixture of relief and humiliation. He had avoided immediate termination, but only by essentially admitting that Marcus and Johnson had been right about his shortcomings. He was going to have to spend the next several months pretending to learn lessons about collaboration while trying to figure out how to protect his career from Marcus's political machinations. Sarah was still awake when he showed her Johnson's response.
"This is good news," she said.
"It means you'll have time to gather information and plan your next move carefully."
"It also means Marcus won.
He successfully painted me as the problem, and now I'm being sent to remedial training for team players."
Sarah took his hand. "David, this isn't over.
Marcus may have won this battle, but the war isn't finished.
The mentorship program gives you access to other senior people in the firm.
It gives you cover to ask questions and learn more about how things really work there. And it gives you time to build a case if you decide you want to fight this properly." David squeezed her hand back.
"Sarah, I owe you an apology.
You tried to warn me about exactly what happened today, and I didn't listen. I thought I could just march in there with facts and truth and everything would work out. You don't owe me an apology for believing in justice and fairness. You owe yourself a commitment to be smarter about how you pursue those things." As David finally fell asleep, he realized that his wife had been trying to teach him something important about how power actually works in professional environments. Tomorrow, he would start learning those lessons in earnest. But he also promised himself that he wouldn't let Marcus's victory stand unchallenged forever. The mentorship program might be his punishment, but it was also going to be his education in the very political skills he would need to eventually expose what Marcus was doing. Sarah had been right about avoiding the fight he had planned, but she had also given him the tools to plan a much better fight for the future. 6 months later, David Martinez walked into the same coffee shop where Sarah had tried to warn him against his confrontation with Johnson. This time, he was carrying a resignation letter and a job offer from Fletcher & Associates, one of Morrison & Associates' biggest competitors. Sarah was already there, waiting at their usual table with 2 cups of coffee. She smiled as he sat down, but David could see the concern in her eyes. "So today's the day?" she asked. David nodded, pulling the resignation letter from his briefcase.
"Johnson is expecting me at 10 o'clock.
I'm going to give him this and thank him for the learning opportunity."
Sarah picked up the letter and read it quickly. It's professional and gracious. No burning bridges. That was the idea.
David took a sip of his coffee.
"Sarah, I need to tell you something. You were right about everything 6 months ago. But you were also wrong about one thing." Sarah raised an eyebrow.
"Oh? You said that fight wasn't worth my career. But it turns out it was worth my career, just not in the way I expected." Over the past 6 months, David's enrollment in Morrison & Associates' mentorship program had given him access to senior architects throughout the firm. What he had discovered during those carefully structured conversations had been far more extensive than his original suspicions about Marcus. Marcus's pattern of appropriating junior architects' innovations wasn't limited to David. Over the course of 8 years, Marcus had systematically taken credit for breakthrough designs created by at least 12 different team members. The firm's leadership either didn't know or didn't care, because Marcus's projects were consistently profitable and his clients were satisfied. But, more importantly, David had learned that several former Morrison employees had left the firm and found great success elsewhere, specifically because they had taken their unrecognized innovations with them. Fletcher & Associates had hired 3 former Morrison architects in the past 2 years, and all 3 had brought detailed knowledge of design approaches that Morrison had failed to properly credit or develop. "The mentorship program taught me something valuable," David continued.
"It wasn't about learning to collaborate better.
It was about learning to document everything, build relationships with the right people, and understand how information flows through organizations." David had used his 6 months wisely. While pretending to learn lessons about teamwork and professional development, he had quietly gathered evidence not just about Marcus's behavior, but about Morrison & Associates' systematic undervaluation of innovative design work. He had also reached out to former Morrison employees who had left under similar circumstances. "Fletcher & Associates isn't just offering me a job," David explained. "They're offering me a chance to lead a new team specifically focused on developing the kind of innovative approaches that Morrison has been overlooking. And they're doing it because they know that Morrison is hemorrhaging talent due to their broken recognition system."
Sarah looked impressed.
"So you're not just escaping Marcus. You're positioning yourself to compete directly with him."
"Exactly. And I'm not the only one.
2 other architects from Morrison are joining Fletcher within the next month. People who have been frustrated with similar situations."
David had learned that Marcus's success was creating long-term problems for Morrison & Associates.
While his projects were profitable in the short term, the firm was losing its most innovative designers to competitors who better understood how to recognize and develop creative talent. "The beautiful part is that Fletcher specifically recruited me because of my experience with Morrison's recent projects. They want me to help them compete for exactly the kind of high-profile commissions that Marcus has been winning."
Sarah smiled.
"So Marcus's strategy of taking credit for your work has actually ended up advertising your capabilities to his competitors."
"That's one way to look at it. But the real lesson is that you can't fight political manipulation with righteous indignation. You have to fight it with better politics."
David's resignation strategy had been carefully planned. Instead of leaving in anger or making accusations, he was positioning his departure as a professional growth opportunity. This would make it harder for Marcus to spin the narrative as David being unable to handle collaborative work.
"What about Johnson? Do you think he knows what's been happening?"
David had thought about this question for months. "I think Johnson knows exactly what Marcus is doing, and he's made a calculated decision that it's worth it. Marcus brings in revenue and maintains client relationships. From Johnson's perspective, the cost of losing a few individual contributors is acceptable as long as the projects get completed successfully."
"That's pretty cynical."
"It's realistic. And understanding that has helped me make better decisions about my own career." At 9:30, David finished his coffee and prepared to leave for his final meeting at Morrison & Associates.
But, first, he had one more thing to share with Sarah. Sarah, there's something else. Fletcher and Associates is planning to pursue the Henderson project when Morrison's contract comes up for renewal next year. And, they want me to lead the design team. Sarah's eyes widened. The Henderson project? That's the one Marcus got promoted for. That's the one I actually designed, with Marcus taking credit. Fletcher knows this because two of Morrison's former employees have confirmed the details. When the contract comes up for renewal, Fletcher is going to propose a design approach that builds on innovations Marcus claimed as his own, but they'll be honest about who actually created them. David had realized that the best revenge against Marcus wouldn't be exposing him within Morrison and Associates, where Johnson was invested in protecting the existing power structure. The best revenge would be outcompeting him in the marketplace, using the very innovations that Marcus had appropriated. So in the end, your confrontation with Johnson actually worked, just not the way you planned it. No, Sarah. In the end, your advice about avoiding that fight actually worked, just not the way you planned it. If I had continued pushing against Marcus directly, I would have been fired and blacklisted. Instead, I used the time to understand the system and figure out how to beat it. As David walked toward Morrison and Associates for the last time, he reflected on how much he had learned about power, politics, and professional strategy. Sarah had been right that his original approach would have been disastrous, but she had also given him something more valuable than just avoiding immediate consequences. She had forced him to think strategically instead of just reacting emotionally. The mentorship program that had initially felt like humiliation had actually been the perfect cover for gathering intelligence and building relationships that would serve him throughout his career. When David entered Johnson's office at 10 o'clock, he was greeted with unexpected warmth. David, good to see you. I hear congratulations are in order. Fletcher and Associates is an excellent firm. David was surprised. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I hope there are no hard feelings about my departure. Johnson waved dismissively. Of course not. The mentorship program is designed to help people grow, and sometimes that growth leads to new opportunities. I'm glad it worked out well for you. As David handed over his resignation letter, he realized that Johnson's casual attitude confirmed his suspicions. The firm was used to losing talented people and had made peace with it as a cost of doing business. I want you to know that I learned a lot during my time here, especially these past 6 months. The mentorship program really helped me understand how successful architectural firms operate. Johnson nodded approvingly. I'm glad to hear that. And, David, I hope you know that you're always welcome to reach out if you need references or recommendations. Your technical skills were never in question. David thanked Johnson and left the building feeling lighter than he had in months. As he drove home, he thought about calling Sarah to tell her how the meeting had gone, but decided to wait until he got home so they could celebrate properly. That evening, Sarah made David's favorite dinner, and they spent the evening talking about his plans for Fletcher and Associates. David would be starting as a senior architect with his own project team, and he had already been assigned to develop proposals for 3 major commissions. So what's the lesson in all this? Sarah asked as they cleaned up the kitchen. David considered the question. The lesson is that you can't fight systems by attacking them directly. You have to understand how they work and, then, use that understanding to create better alternatives. And the lesson about us? About our marriage and how we handle these kinds of crises. David put down the dish he was drying and took Sarah's hands. The lesson is that you see things I miss, and I need to listen to you even when your advice feels overly cautious. But also that sometimes the fight is worth having, as long as you fight it smart. Sarah smiled. I can live with that lesson. 6 weeks later, David was settled into his new office at Fletcher and Associates when he received an unexpected phone call. It was Jennifer, his former assistant at Morrison. Mr. Martinez, I hope you don't mind me calling you at your new job, but I thought you should know something. Marcus has been asking questions about you, and he seems pretty upset about where you ended up. David wasn't surprised. Fletcher and Associates had announced their new strategic hires in the industry trade publications, and Marcus would have seen David's name and new title.
What kind of questions? He's been asking people what you might have said about him before you left, whether you took any files with you, things like that. Mr. Johnson told him to let it go, but Marcus seems really worried about something. After the call, David realized that Marcus probably understood the implications of David's move to Fletcher better than anyone else at Morrison. Marcus knew exactly which innovations David had created, and he would be able to figure out that Fletcher now had access to those same creative approaches. David found himself smiling as he hung up the phone. Marcus's political skills had served him well within Morrison's internal hierarchy, but they wouldn't help him when Fletcher started competing for his projects with superior design innovations and honest attribution of credit. The fight that Sarah had warned him against had indeed been the wrong fight. But the fight that her advice had made possible was turning out to be exactly the right one. And this time, David was playing to win.